The train groaned, a weary iron beast surrendering to the end of its line. Clara watched through the grimy window as the last of the rugged, snow-dusted plains gave way to the skeletal structures of Bitter Ridge. Montana. The town looked less built than clawed from the unforgiving earth. A handful of wooden buildings stood hunched against a wind that carried the scent of pine and the promise of more snow. There was no welcome in it. She pressed a gloved hand to the cold glass, her breath misting the pain. This was it, the culmination of 1,000 desperate miles traveled. A bargain struck through letters penned in a trembling hand. She was to be Mrs. Cyrus Broder, wife to a homesteader she had never met, a man whose terse, functional letters spoke of land and little else. He had promised a life free from the suffocating civility of the East, a life where a woman's worth was measured in grit, not in her father's name. For Clara, it was a promise of escape. Stepping from the train car was like walking into a wall of ice. The wind tore at her fine wool coat, a garment far too delicate for this world, and whipped stray strands of auburn hair across her face. The platform was nearly deserted. A few rough-looking men in heavy coats loaded freight, their faces chapped red by the cold, their eyes sliding over her with a dispassionate curiosity before dismissing her. She stood beside her single trunk, a solitary figure of out-of-place refinement, and waited. She scanned the faces, searching for the man from the small, faded photograph he had sent. A man in his 50s, with a stern face, a thick beard, and eyes that seemed to squint against a perpetual sun. But he was not there. The station master gave her a pitying look and retreated into the warmth of his office. The minutes stretched into a quarter of an hour, then a half, a knot of cold dread, more biting than the wind, tightened in her stomach. Had he changed his mind? Had this entire desperate gamble been for nothing? Just as a tremor of real panic began to shake her, a man detached himself from the shadows of the livery stable across the road. He moved with a quiet, deliberate economy, his long duster coat brushing against the tops of worn leather boots. He was not Cyrus Broder. This man was younger, leaner, with a face carved from the same hard granite as the surrounding mountains. His hat was pulled low, but she could see the sharp line of his jaw and a mouth set in a permanent, unsmiling line. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze sweeping over her once, taking in the expensive coat, the small, impractical boots, the hope draining from her face. His eyes, the color of a winter sky just before a storm, held no warmth, only a deep, weary stillness. "You the woman for Broder?" His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It was not a question so much as a confirmation. Clara straightened her shoulders, forcing a composure she did not feel. "I am Miss Clara May Thompson. I was to be met by Mr. Cyrus Broder." The man gave a curt nod. "He ain't coming. Snow's moving in faster than he figured. Sent me to fetch you. Name's Eli Kincaid." He offered no further explanation, no apology for his employer's absence. He simply bent, lifted her heavy trunk with an ease that suggested it weighed nothing, and slung it over one shoulder. "Wagon's over here. We need to move if we're to beat the worst of it." Clara hesitated. To go with this stranger, this silent, imposing man, into the wilderness felt like a profound misstep. But what choice did she have? The train back east was not an option. Returning meant facing her father, and the bruises he called discipline were a far greater terror than a Montana blizzard. She clutched her small valise and followed Eli Kincaid, her boots sinking into the thin layer of snow that already covered the frozen mud of the street. The wagon was little more than a wooden box on wheels, hitched to two sturdy horses whose coats were thick with winter fur. Eli placed her trunk in the back and gestured for her to climb up onto the seat. He did not offer a hand. As he moved to the other side, she saw the worn holster strapped to his hip, the wooden handle of the revolver dark and smooth from use. He was not a simple ranch hand. There was a coiled stillness about him, the dangerous patience of a predator. He took the reins, and with a soft click of his tongue, the wagon lurched forward, leaving the small outpost of Bitter Ridge behind. The silence between them was as vast and empty as the landscape. The sky had turned a flat, bruised gray, and the wind began to keen, a low, mournful sound that seeped into Clara's bones. Eli kept his eyes on the trail ahead, his profile sharp and unyielding against the white horizon. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, pulling the coat tighter. It was useless against this kind of cold, a cold that felt alive, actively seeking entry. She thought of the letters she had written to Cyrus, filled with carefully constructed lies about her eagerness for a frontier life, her desire for a simple, hard-working husband. She had omitted the parts about the locked doors, the accidents down the stairs, the quiet terror of her father's heavy footfalls in the hall. Cyrus Broder was a tool, a means to an end. A harsh life on a homestead was a price she was willing to pay for her freedom. Now, sitting beside this grim escort, she wondered if she had merely traded one cage for another, colder one. An hour into their journey, the snow began to fall in earnest, no longer gentle flurries, but thick, wet flakes that clung to her eyelashes and melted on her cheeks like icy tears. The trail grew harder to see, the world dissolving into a swirl of gray and white. Eli's focus never wavered. He seemed to navigate by instinct, a part of this harsh land in a way she could never be. "Should we not stop?" she finally asked, her voice thin against the rising wind. "Stopping's how you freeze," he said without looking at her. "Cabin's another 2 hours. We keep moving." His bluntness left no room for argument. She fell silent again, her anxiety growing with each passing mile. The cold was a physical pain now, a deep ache in her joints. She could feel the dampness of her wedding dress, packed carefully in her trunk, seeping into her imagination. It was a simple ivory gown, bought with the last of her mother's inheritance, the only thing of value that was truly hers. It was meant to be the uniform of her new life, a symbol of her rebirth. The horses strained, their breath pluming in the frigid air. The wagon wheels groaned in the deepening snow. Clara's mind started to drift, haunted by specters of her past. She could almost feel the phantom grip on her arm, the sting of a backhanded remark that left a deeper mark than any fist. She flinched, a small, involuntary movement. For the first time? Eli's gaze shifted to her. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, the way she shrank into herself. He saw more than the cold. His expression didn't change, but he looked away quickly, his jaw tightening as if at a memory of his own. They were in a stretch of scattered pines when he suddenly pulled the horses to a halt. The abrupt stop jolted Clara from her thoughts. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Eli didn't answer. He was staring at something off the trail, a dark shape nearly lost in the swirling snow. He wrapped the reins around the brake handle and swung down from the wagon. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice flat but absolute. He pulled his revolver from its holster, the metallic sound sharp and clean in the muffled air. He moved toward the shape with a cautious, practiced gait, his body tense. Clara watched, her heart hammering against her ribs. Wolves? A bear? Her Eastern imagination supplied a dozen terrifying possibilities. Eli knelt beside the shape, disappearing for a moment behind a thicket of snow-laden branches. The silence stretched, broken only by the howl of the wind and the nervous stomping of the horses. When he stood up again, he moved slowly, his shoulders slumped with a heavy finality. He holstered his weapon and walked back to the wagon, his face a mask of grim stone. He looked up at her, and the raw truth was in his eyes before he ever spoke a word. "It's Broder," he said. The words were stripped of all emotion, a simple, brutal statement of fact. "Horse must have thrown him. Looks like he broke his leg. He never had a chance in this cold." The world seemed to tilt. Cyrus Broder, dead. Frozen on the trail he had sent another man to travel. The man who was her future, her escape. was now just a frozen corpse half buried in the snow. A wave of nausea and disbelief washed over Clara. Her mind went blank. A canvas wiped clean by shock. She could not process it. All that planning, all that fear, all that desperate hope, extinguished in an instant. Eli watched her, his expression unreadable. "We have to go back to town," he said, his voice softer now, but still practical. "There's nothing to be done for him. I'll report it to the sheriff when the storm breaks." Go back? The words jolted her back to life. Go back to Bitter Ridge, a stranger, a bride-to-be whose intended was dead, a woman alone, with no money and nowhere to go. They would put her on the next train east, back to her father's house. The thought was a physical blow, more terrifying than the dead man in the snow, more terrifying than the blizzard closing in around them. The bruises her father had left on her soul were deeper and colder than any Montana winter. "No," she whispered, the word a small puff of defiance in the icy air. Eli frowned. "Ma'am, you ain't hearing me? The man is dead. The cabin is empty. You got no claim here now. We're turning back." "No," she said again, louder this time, her voice shaking but laced with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I will not go back. I cannot." She looked him straight in the eye, letting him see the desperation, the sheer terror that fueled her. "Take me to the cabin. Please. I would rather face this storm alone in that cabin than go back." Eli stared at her, his sharp eyes searching her face. He saw the genuine fear there, a fear that went beyond her current predicament. He saw the resolve hardening her delicate features. He saw a woman who was not mourning a fiancé she never knew, but a future she had just lost. For a long moment, he was silent, the wind whipping the snow around them in a furious dance. He had been paid to bring her to the homestead. The job was, in a way, still unfinished, and some part of him, some long-buried instinct to protect, recognized the truth in her plea. Leaving her in town would be its own kind of death sentence. He let out a slow breath. His decision made. "The cabin ain't stocked for a long spell," he warned. "And this storm looks to be a bad one. It's a fool's choice." "It's my choice," she answered, her chin held high. He gave a final, reluctant nod. "Get in the back of the wagon, under the tarp. You'll be out of the worst of the wind." He didn't wait for her to argue. He turned and began clearing a path for the wagon, pushing on into the teeth of the blizzard. Clara scrambled into the back, pulling the heavy canvas tarp over herself. Huddled in the darkness next to her trunk, she felt the wagon lurch forward again. A small, fragile vessel in a sea of white. The shock gave way to a cold, hollow ache. She was a widow before she was ever a wife, adrift, utterly and completely alone, save for the silent man guiding them toward a dead man's home. She did not cry. Tears were a luxury, an indulgence her father had beaten out of her long ago. Crying showed weakness, and weakness was an invitation for more pain. It felt like an eternity later when the wagon finally stopped. The wind was a shrieking banshee, and the snow was a solid, blinding curtain. Through a small gap in the tarp, she saw the faint, blocky outline of a cabin. Eli was already unhitching the horses, his movements swift and efficient even in the blizzard. "Inside," he yelled over the storm, his voice barely audible. "Doors unlocked!" Clara stumbled out of the wagon, her limbs stiff and numb. She pushed her way through snow that was already knee-deep, the cold burning her lungs with every breath. The cabin was small, made of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud. It looked as lonely and desolate as she felt. She pushed the heavy wooden door open and fell inside, collapsing into the oppressive cold and darkness of the single room. Eli followed a few moments later, carrying her trunk in one arm and his saddlebags in the other. He kicked the door shut against the raging storm, plunging the room into near total blackness. The sound of the wind was slightly muted now, but the walls of the cabin groaned and creaked under its assault, as if the entire structure might be torn apart at any moment. He fumbled in the dark, and soon there was the scratch of a match, the flare of light revealing a small lantern on a crude wooden table. He lit the wick, and a weak, flickering golden light pushed back the shadows. The cabin was sparse, furnished with a table, 2 chairs, a narrow cot, and a large stone fireplace. Cold and dark. A small stack of firewood lay beside it. On the table sat a half-empty bottle of whiskey and a single, dirty glass. This was Cyrus Broder's home. This was to have been her sanctuary. Eli said nothing. He went straight to the fireplace and began methodically laying a fire, his movements precise and economical. Clara stood shivering in the center of the room. Her fine coat now soaked and heavy, the dampness had seeped through to her dress beneath. The chill was no longer on her skin. It was in her marrow, a deep, cellular cold that seemed to emanate from her very soul. The fire caught, the small flames crackling to life, a tiny pocket of warmth and light in the vast, frozen emptiness. But it wasn't enough. It couldn't reach the cold inside her. She began to unravel then, not with tears or screams, but with a quiet, desperate trembling that shook her entire body. Her new life was over. Her old life was waiting. She was trapped by the storm, trapped by her past, trapped in a dead man's house with a stranger who looked at her with eyes as cold as the wind. She was still wearing her gloves, but her fingers were numb. She looked down at her trunk, which held the simple ivory wedding dress, the symbol of a freedom she had never truly grasped. It felt like a mockery now. She pulled her damp, useless coat tighter around her body, a futile gesture against the overwhelming chill. The fire flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the rough log walls. Eli was still crouched by the hearth, his back to her, a solid, unmoving silhouette. A whisper escaped her lips, so quiet it was nearly lost in the howl of the wind. "I need warmth. Inside." It was not a request directed at him, or at anyone. It was a plea to the universe, the raw, unguarded cry of a heart that had been cold for far too long. The first morning, silence was the loudest sound. The wind had not died, but its shriek had settled into a deep, unending moan that vibrated through the log walls. Clara awoke on the narrow cot, stiff and cold, to a world that had been erased. The single small window was a solid, luminous white. The snow piled so high it had buried them completely. For a terrifying moment, she felt as if she were in a coffin, the world outside gone forever. Eli was already awake, a dark shape hunched by the hearth, feeding sticks into the fledgling fire. He moved with a quiet purpose that seemed to defy the chaos outside. He had taken off his duster and hat, and in the low firelight, she saw him more clearly. His hair was dark and shorn close to his scalp, his face all hard angles and shadows. He looked like a man who had been whittled down by hardship, with nothing soft left on him. He did not acknowledge her stirring. He finished with the fire, then took a bucket and scooped it full of snow from a drift that had pushed its way under the door. He set it on a hook over the flames to melt for water. It was a simple, domestic act, yet he performed it with the grim efficiency of a soldier preparing a defensive line. Their days fell into a rhythm dictated by the storm and the stark necessities of survival. Life shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin. Their world was the crackle of the fire, the taste of boiled beans and dry biscuits, the endless howl of the wind. Each morning, Eli would venture out, a rope tied around his waist and secured to the cabin door, to fight his way to the small lean-to where the horses were sheltered. He would return covered in snow, his face raw from the wind, to report that the animals were fine and the snow was still falling. His trips for firewood were the same, a battle against the elements for the fuel that kept them alive. He kept his distance. He was a creature of silence, speaking only when necessary. His words clipped and functional. "Water's ready. Eat. More wood on the fire." He seemed to occupy as little space as possible. a ghost at the edge of her strange new reality. Yet, he was a constant, solid presence. He made sure she ate, that the warmest spot by the fire was hers, that the blanket on her cot was dry. They were small, unspoken kindnesses, delivered without a hint of warmth, as if he were simply performing a duty. Clara watched him, intrigued and a little frightened by the deep well of sorrow she saw in his eyes. She saw it most clearly when he thought she was not looking. Sometimes, he would stare into the flames, his hands resting on his knees, and his guard would fall. The hardness in his face would soften into a profound weariness, the look of a man who had seen too much and felt too much. One afternoon, he took out his revolver to clean it. His movements were practiced, familiar, but as he slid the cylinder back into place, his hand began to tremble, a fine, barely perceptible tremor. He quickly clenched his fist, his knuckles turning white, and the shaking stopped. He slid the weapon back into its holster with a sharp, final motion, his jaw set like iron. He was a man haunted, and the ghosts were close. After the initial shock of her situation subsided, a stubborn resolve began to take its place. Clara refused to be a fragile thing, waiting to be rescued or to perish. She would not be pitied, least of all by the silent man who shared her prison. Her father had tried to break her spirit with his cruelty, to make her feel as small and worthless as he believed all women to be. She would not let this wilderness finish the job. So she began to build a life within the confines of the cabin. On the third day, she found a worn broom in a corner and swept the dirt floor until it was clean. She took the few tin plates and cups and washed them with hot water, scrubbing them with a handful of pine needles until they shone. The cabin was Cyrus Broder's, but his presence was faint, the ghost of a man who had lived a solitary, unadorned life. She found a small crate that held a few precious candles, and each evening, as the light failed, she would light one. The small, steady flame was an act of defiance against the oppressive darkness, a declaration that they were still civilized, that they were more than just two animals sheltering from a storm. Eli watched her silent industry without comment, but she felt his eyes on her. She felt his surprise as she organized the meager sacks of flour and beans, his quiet consideration as she folded the rough blankets on her cot into a neat square. She was not the helpless city woman he had likely assumed her to be. She was showing him, without words, that she was a survivor, just like him. The fragile truce of their silence was built on a foundation of unspoken things. They did not speak of the frozen man on the trail. They did not speak of what would happen when the snow finally stopped. They existed only in the present, a long, unbroken moment of cold and waiting. One afternoon, Eli returned from the lean-to with a long tear in the sleeve of his coat, a dark gash in the heavy wool. It had clearly caught on a nail or a sharp branch. He took it off and hung it on a peg by the door, seemingly oblivious to the damage. Clara saw it and felt a stir of purpose. Here was something she could fix, a small tear in the fabric of their grim existence that she could mend. She went to her trunk and retrieved the small sewing kit her mother had given her years ago. It was one of her few treasures. "Mr. Kincaid," she said softly, holding up the needle and a spool of dark thread. He turned, his face questioning. "Your coat," she said, gesturing toward it. "If you'll allow me, I can mend that tear for you." He looked from her to the coat and back again. For a moment, she thought he would refuse. His instinct was to need nothing, to accept nothing, but he gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod and took the coat from the peg. He handed it to her, the rough fabric still cold and smelling of snow and horse. She sat on one of the hard wooden chairs near the fire, the coat across her lap. Eli remained standing, watching her. The silence in the cabin felt different now, charged with a new tension. Her fingers, though still chilled, moved with a practiced grace, pushing the needle through the thick wool. To get a better angle, she needed to hold the sleeve steady. She reached out, her fingers intending to grasp the fabric near his wrist where he held the other end of the sleeve for her. Her fingertips brushed the skin on the back of his hand. He flinched as if she had burned him. A sharp, violent recoil, pulling his arm back so quickly the coat was nearly yanked from her lap. The reaction was so sudden, so total, that Clara froze, her needle poised in midair. She looked up at him. His face was a mask, but she saw the turmoil in his eyes, a flicker of something that looked like shame, or perhaps fear. He stared at the spot where she had touched him as if he could still feel the phantom heat of her skin. I am sorry," she stammered, her cheeks flushing. "I did not mean to—" She let the words trail off, not knowing what she had done. Eli did not answer. He simply stared at her for a long, heavy moment before turning away. He walked to the other side of the cabin and stood with his back to her, looking at the snow-blanketed window as if he could see through it, to some other place, some other time. He did not explain why he had pulled away. He did not have to. In that single, violent reaction, he had told her more about his past than any words could. He was a man who recoiled from a simple, gentle touch. He was a man who carried wounds so deep that an act of kindness felt like a threat. Clara finished mending the coat, her hands trembling slightly now. Her stitches were small and even, a neat, dark line closing the tear. When she was done, she folded the coat carefully and placed it on the chair. She did not say a word. The silence that fell between them was heavier than before, filled with the things they could not say, the pasts they could not share. That night, the cold deepened. It was a vicious, predatory cold that seeped through the chinking in the logs and crept across the floor in icy drafts. The fire, though blazing, seemed to push it back only a few feet. Beyond that small circle of warmth, the cabin was an icebox. Clara lay on her cot, buried under 2 blankets, but she could not stop shivering. The cold was a physical pain, an ache that started in her bones and spread outward. Her feet were numb, her fingers like sticks of ice. She curled into a tight ball, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. She thought she might simply freeze to death here, in this dead man's bed. Eli sat by the fire, oiling the leather of his saddlebags. He seemed immune to the cold, a figure carved from winter itself, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept glancing over at her huddled, shivering form. The hours wore on. The wind howled its mournful song. Clara felt a strange, light-headed despair begin to settle over her. She was so tired of being cold, not just in her body, but in her soul. Her whole life had been a winter, a long season of fear and loneliness. Her father's house had been cold with a lack of love. Her arranged marriage was a cold calculation for survival. And now this, a literal killing cold that mirrored the emptiness inside her. She could not bear it another moment. She sat up, the blankets falling away. The frigid air hit her like a slap. Eli looked up, his work forgotten, his eyes locking on hers in the flickering light. Her voice was a fragile whisper, cracked with cold and desperation. "I need warmth, inside." She slid off the cot and took one of the blankets with her. She did not walk to the fire. She walked to him. She stood before him, a small, trembling woman in a simple dress, her eyes pleading. Without another word, she laid the blanket on the floorboards, as close to the hearth as she dared, and then sank down upon it. She looked up at him and patted the empty space beside her. It was an invitation, a plea, and a profound transgression of the silent boundaries they had erected between them. Eli stared at the space on the blanket, then at her. He was frozen, caught between his ingrained instinct to keep his distance and the undeniable sight of her suffering. He could see the blue tinge on her lips, the violent tremors that shook her frame. To leave her there alone would be an act of cruelty, and whatever else he was not a cruel man. Slowly, as if moving against a powerful current, he rose and laid his own blanket down next to hers. He settled onto it, a foot of space between them, his body rigid. He lay on his back, staring up at the dark, smoke-stained beams of the ceiling. Clara pulled her blanket around her shoulders and lay on her side, facing the fire. The warmth on her face was a blessing, but her back was still exposed to the biting cold of the room. The space between them felt like a canyon, a chasm of icy air. After a moment of hesitation, driven by a cold that was stronger than her fear, she shuffled closer, until her back was nearly touching his. She could feel the heat radiating from him, a solid, living warmth that was so different from the dry heat of the fire. They lay like that for a long time, two stiff and separate figures sharing a small patch of floor. The tension was thick enough to taste. Then, slowly, as if she were reaching for a wild, easily startled animal, Clara extended her hand under the cover of her blanket. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, brushed against his. His entire body went rigid. He started to pull his hand away, a reflexive retreat into the solitary fortress of his pain. But this time, Clara would not let him go. Her trembling fingers closed around his. She held on, her grip surprisingly strong. It was not a romantic gesture. It was a plea for contact, for a single point of human warmth in an ocean of cold. It was the desperate act of a drowning woman clinging to a piece of driftwood. Eli stopped pulling away. He did not intertwine his fingers with hers, but he allowed her to hold his hand. It was a monumental concession. He lay perfectly still, his calloused, scarred hand held captive by her small, cold one. They did not speak. They did not kiss. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the howling of the storm. But in the quiet darkness of the cabin, in the simple, desperate act of holding hands, something shifted. The silence between them was no longer empty. It became a shared space, a vessel for all their unspoken fears and sorrows. The warmth that began to seep from his hand into hers was more than just physical heat. It was the first flicker of a different kind of fire, a tiny spark lit against an overwhelming darkness. And for the first time in a very long time, Clara did not feel entirely alone. The storm did not break. It settled in, a malevolent presence that owned the world. Days bled into nights, marked only by the shifting quality of the white light at the window. Time lost its meaning, becoming a slow, grinding wheel of survival. The hunger started as a dull ache and sharpened into a constant, gnawing pain. Their supply of beans and flour dwindled, and each biscuit seemed smaller than the last. The cold was a relentless thief, stealing the strength from their limbs, leaving a weariness that settled deep in their bones. They moved like specters in the flickering firelight, their conversations shrinking to the barest essentials. The world outside the cabin ceased to exist. There was only the wind, the fire, and the yawning emptiness of their bellies. In the crucible of this isolation, the carefully constructed walls they had built around themselves began to crack, eroded by hunger and the profound, shared loneliness. One afternoon, the wind died down just enough for the sound of a distant howl to cut through the air. Wolves. Close. Eli's head snapped up, his body instantly alert. He looked at Clara, at her wide, frightened eyes, and a decision formed on his grim face. He rose and unbuckled his gun belt, laying it on the table. The revolver looked heavy and menacing against the rough-hewn wood. "You need to know how to use this," he said, his voice flat. It was not a suggestion. Clara stared at the weapon. It was an object of pure violence, a tool for ending life. The thought of touching it made her stomach clench. I could not." "You will," he said, his tone leaving no room for refusal. "I might be out with the horses. I might be asleep. The wolves get bold when they're hungry, and wolves ain't the worst thing that walks in these mountains." He took the gun and expertly emptied the cartridges onto the table, the brass casings gleaming in the firelight. He showed her the mechanisms, his long, scarred fingers moving with an unnerving familiarity. He explained the hammer, the trigger, the cylinder, his voice a low, patient monotone. He was teaching her a trade he knew too well. He placed the empty revolver in her hand. The weight of it surprised her, a cold, solid heaviness that felt alien and wrong. It was heavier than any tool a woman was meant to hold. Her hand trembled under its burden. "Hold it steady," he instructed, his voice close to her ear. He stood behind her, his body not quite touching hers, but she could feel his presence like a wall of heat at her back. He adjusted her grip, his fingers briefly closing over hers. His touch was firm, impersonal, but it sent a jolt through her. You ain't aiming to admire it. You point it at what you mean to kill. You pull the hammer back. You squeeze the trigger. You do not jerk it. He reloaded a single cartridge and had her practice aiming at a knot in the far wall. The simple act of pointing the weapon at an imaginary target made her feel sick. This was the tool of men like her father, a symbol of the brutal power that had governed her life. But here, in Eli's hands, it was being offered as something else, a means of defense, a last resort, a sliver of power in a powerless world. Her hands shook so badly she could not keep the barrel still. A tear of frustration and fear slipped down her cheek. "I cannot—" "You can," he insisted, his voice low but unyielding. "Fear's good. It keeps you alive, but you can't let it own you. You take that fear and you put it in your finger, and you squeeze." He stood with her for the better part of an hour, his patience seemingly endless, until the trembling in her hands subsided into a manageable tremor. She never fired the gun, but she learned its weight, its cold purpose. When he finally took it from her, the release was so profound her knees felt weak. She had crossed a line. She had held death in her hand, and in some small, terrifying way, it had made her feel a little more alive. The lesson changed something between them, in sharing the knowledge of his violent world. Eli had offered her a piece of himself. In the long, dark evenings that followed, sitting by the fire, he began to talk. The stories came out in fragments, like chips of stone broken from a larger, hidden rock. He spoke of the war, not of battles or glory, but of the mud and the cold and the ceaseless noise. He spoke of riding with a rough outfit after, when there was no work and a man with a gun could make a living if he did not mind the sin of it. "There was a girl," he said one night, his voice barely a whisper as he stared into the flames. "In a town in Kansas. We were passing through. The boys, they'd been drinking. They saw her as something to be taken." He paused, his throat working. "I tried to stop it. I wasn't fast enough or strong enough." He fell silent, but Clara could see the scene playing out in his haunted eyes. "The blood," he murmured, so quietly she almost did not hear it. "Some things you never wash off." He never told her the whole story. He left the details to the shadows, but Clara could piece them together. He was a man running from the ghosts of his own failures, a man who believed he was beyond redemption. He had failed to protect someone, and the guilt was a shroud he wore every single day. Clara listened. She did not ask questions or offer empty words of comfort. She simply sat with him in the darkness and listened, offering him the silent solace of her presence. But she shared none of her own story. When he would fall into one of his dark silences, she would find a way to distract him, to pull him back from the edge. She would smile, a small, sad curve of her lips, and ask him about the horses. Or she would tell a story her mother used to tell her about a clever fox. She built a wall of gentle deflections, keeping her own secrets locked away. She was not ready to show him her wounds. She was afraid that if he saw the true extent of her damage, he would see her as broken, as pitiful, and she would rather freeze to death than be pitied. One morning, the wind finally stilled. The silence was jarring, a physical presence in the cabin. Eli rose early and went to check on the horses, leaving Clara alone with the quiet. A strange, reckless impulse seized her. She went to her trunk and opened it. There, nestled among her few practical belongings, was the ivory wedding dress. It was a symbol of a lie, of a desperate bargain made in a gilded cage. It was the price of her escape, and the man she had bought it for was dead. She lifted the dress from the trunk. The fabric was cold and smooth beneath her fingers. Holding it, she felt the full weight of her situation crash down on her. She was not Cyrus Broder's widow. She was nothing, a runaway, stranded in the middle of nowhere, her name on no deed, her future a blank, terrifying canvas. On impulse, she took the dress and, clad only in her thin nightgown, she unbarred the door. The cold was a physical shock, a breathtaking, searing pain. A narrow path had been carved by Eli's comings and goings, but beyond it, the snow was a vast, untouched wilderness, sparkling under a sky of pale, brittle blue. Shivering violently, she stumbled a few yards from the cabin and began to dig at the deep snow with her bare hands. The cold burned her skin, but she did not stop. When she had carved out a shallow hollow, she laid the wedding dress inside it. Then she pushed the snow back over it, burying the symbol of her failed hope, interring the woman she was supposed to have become. She stood there for a moment, her breath pluming in the frigid air. The task complete. A great, shuddering tremor ran through her, a sob without sound. She had just buried her own life. "Clara," Eli's voice, sharp with alarm, cut through her stupor. He was standing by the lean-to, a shovel in his hand, his face a mask of disbelief and concern. He dropped the tool and ran to her, his boots sinking deep in the snow. He reached her and, without a word, swept her up into his arms. She was so light, so fragile. He carried her back inside as if she weighed nothing, his strides urgent. He kicked the door shut behind them and set her down by the fire. She was shaking so hard she could not stand. Her hands and feet were an alarming shade of blue-white. "What were you thinking?" he demanded, his voice rough with a fear he could not hide. He grabbed a blanket and wrapped it tightly around her, then began rubbing her hands between his own, trying to force the life back into them. His touch was not gentle. It was rough, desperate. The warmth of his hands, the raw panic in his voice, broke through the last of her defenses. The wall she had so carefully maintained crumbled into dust. "It was for a life I never wanted," she whispered, her teeth chattering. "With a man I never knew." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a desolation that went far beyond the cold. And for the first time, she told him the truth. The words came out in a torrent, hesitant and broken. She told him of her father, a wealthy man whose respectability was a carefully constructed facade. She spoke of a house that was not a home, but a prison, of a quiet, smiling cruelty that left bruises on the soul and sometimes on the skin. "He was arranging a marriage for me," she said, her voice shaking. "To a man of his choosing, another business transaction, another way to own me." She took a shuddering breath. "Cyrus Broder. His advertisement was in a newspaper. It was a chance, a terrible, desperate chance. He seemed harsh in his letters, but I thought a harsh freedom would be better than a soft cage. He was a necessary evil, a name to hide behind, but now he is gone, and I am stranded." She looked down at her hands, now cradled in his. "I am tired of being passed like property, Mr. Kincaid, from my father's house to another man's. I wanted to be done with it, to bury it." Eli did not speak. He did not interrupt. He simply knelt before her, holding her frozen hands, and he listened. He watched her face, saw the years of pain etched there, and for the first time, he understood the fear he had seen in her eyes on that first day. He understood that she was not running toward a new life, but away from an old one. When she finished, a heavy silence filled the cabin. He just held her hands, his grip firm and steady, until the color began to return to them and the violent shivering began to subside. That night, a new sound joined the chorus of the wilderness, a low, guttural cry, somewhere between a cough and a saw. Eli was on his feet in an instant, grabbing his rifle from its pegs on the wall. He peered through a small crack in the window shutter. In the brilliant, cold moonlight that bathed the snow-covered landscape, he saw it, a shadow, moving with a fluid, predatory grace, a mountain lion, its lean, powerful body circling the cabin, drawn by the scent of the horses or perhaps by the scent of two weak, hungry humans. Eli stood watch at the window for the rest of the night, the rifle resting in the crook of his arm. He was a sentinel, a guardian against the wildness that pressed in on them. A few hours into his vigil, Clara rose from her cot. She had been watching him, a silent statue of readiness. She went to the fire and brewed the last of their tea in a small pot. Her hands were shaking as she poured the weak, steaming liquid into a tin cup. She brought it to him. Their fingers brushed as he took it from her. "Thank you," he murmured, his eyes never leaving the window. She stood beside him for a long time, watching the moonlit snow, her shoulder almost touching his. They were a strange pair, a runaway bride and a broken gunslinger, standing together against the vast, indifferent wilderness. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was different now. It was a shared fear, and it was no longer the only thing she felt. The mountain lion eventually disappeared back into the darkness, but the tension it had created remained, a live wire humming between them. Eli finally turned from the window. The immediate danger passed. He looked at Clara, her face pale and luminous in the moonlight filtering through the crack. All their secrets were out now, laid bare between them. There were no more walls to hide behind. There was only the truth of who they were, two wounded, lonely souls, clinging to life in a frozen world. He took a step toward her. She did not move. He raised a hand, slowly, as if not to startle her, and his calloused fingers gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was hesitant, questioning. It lingered for a heartbeat, a spark of warmth against her cold skin. Clara's breath hitched. She looked into his eyes and saw her own desperate loneliness reflected there. All the fear, the hunger, the cold, the grief, it all coalesced into a single, overwhelming need. A need to feel something other than pain. A need to be seen, to be touched, not with violence or ownership, but with tenderness. She leaned into his touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and that was all the answer he needed. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was a slow, unsure kiss, full of a tentative, questioning softness. His lips were chapped from the cold, but they were gentle. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound, aching need. It was a kiss that spoke of shared sorrows and a desperate, flickering hope. In that moment, surrounded by the ghosts of their pasts and the dangers of the present, something deep inside both of them, something that had been frozen for a very long time, began, finally, to thaw. The first sign of the change was the light. For weeks, the cabin had been submerged in a dim, perpetual twilight, the window a solid block of white. Then, one morning, a watery, gray illumination filtered through, soft and uncertain. The world was returning. The ceaseless howl of the wind had quieted to a low, weary sigh. Outside, the snow was no longer falling. Instead, a slow, almost imperceptible settling had begun. The great white beast of the storm was finally retreating. A fragile, unspoken tenderness had taken root in the cabin since their kiss. They moved around each other with a new awareness, a quiet hesitation. The air was thick with things unsaid, with the ghost of that brief, desperate connection. They were no longer just two strangers bound by a storm. They were a man and a woman who had shared a moment of profound vulnerability, and neither knew what to do with it. The silence, once a neutral space of survival, was now charged with a delicate, trembling tension. Eli seemed even more withdrawn, his guilt and his ghosts having returned with a vengeance. He kept his eyes averted, his jaw perpetually tight. Clara, too, felt a strange mix of hope and fear. The thaw she had felt in her soul was real, but it was a fragile thing, easily broken. It was mid-afternoon when a new sound intruded upon their quiet world. It was faint at first, muffled by the sheer depth of the snow, but unmistakable. The crunch of hooves, the low murmur of men's voices. Clara's first thought was rescue. Her heart gave a hopeful leap. People. The world had not forgotten them. She looked at Eli, a smile starting on her lips. But the expression on his face stopped her cold. He had not moved from his seat by the fire, but his entire body had gone rigid. His hand rested on the table, inches from the butt of his revolver. The stillness in him was more alarming than any sudden movement. "Stay away from the window," he said, his voice a low growl. The voices grew louder, closer. There were 3 of them, their words coarse and clear now in the still air. "This has to be it," one voice boomed, full of rough confidence. "Cyrus was never one for neighbors. This is the only homestead for miles. Still can't believe the old fool went and got himself froze." Another voice, younger and meaner, chimed in. "Serves him right for ordering a mail-order bride. Sight unseen. What kind of man does that?" A third voice, carrying an unpleasant, nasal tone of authority, cut through. "Mind your tongue, Riggs. He was my cousin, and that bride is now a widow. A widow sitting on a prime piece of land." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Cyrus's cousin. She shrank back from the door, moving into the darkest corner of the cabin, her body trembling. This was not rescue. This was a reckoning. "Well, let's see what this widow looks like," the mean voice, Riggs, said with a laugh. "Heard she was holed up in here with that hired hand he sent. Kincaid. Been a long, cold winter. I reckon they found ways to keep warm." The men's laughter was a brutal, ugly sound. It struck Clara like a physical blow. A hot, creeping shame washed over her. So potent it made her feel dizzy. They were talking about her and Eli, twisting the desperate, fragile connection they had forged into something cheap and dirty. "Knock on the door. Jeb," Riggs prodded. "Let's meet the grieving woman." There was a loud, authoritative bang on the heavy wooden door. Eli rose slowly, his movements fluid and deliberate. He looked at Clara, his eyes dark with a protective fury. "Stay back," he mouthed silently. He walked to the door and lifted the heavy bar, pulling it open just enough to look out, his body blocking the entrance. Through the gap, Clara could see them, 3 hard-looking men on horseback, their face chapped and bearded, their eyes small and assessing. One, presumably Jebediah Broder, was a heavy-set man with a self-important air. The other 2 were leaner, younger, with the insolent swagger of men who enjoyed their own cruelty. "Kincaid," Jebediah said, his tone oily. "We came looking for my cousin. Word reached town he never made it back, found his horse wandering." "He's dead," Eli stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "Storm caught him on the trail." Jebediah made a clumsy show of sorrow, shaking his head. "A terrible shame. And the woman, the one he was meant to marry, is she in there?" "She is," Eli said. "Well, we've come to escort her back to town," Jebediah announced, puffing out his chest. "It ain't proper. Her being out here alone with you, the land, the cabin, it all falls to me now. As next of kin, she'll need to be dealt with." The implication hung in the air, thick and foul, dealt with, like a piece of property, an inconvenient complication. Riggs leaned forward on his saddle, a leering grin spreading across his face. "Been mighty cozy in there, Kincaid. A pretty young thing like that, all alone. I'm sure you've been a great comfort to her in her time of grief." Eli's hand moved, a blur of motion, and rested on the handle of his revolver. He did not draw it, but the threat was absolute. "The lady is under my protection," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. "She's been through enough. You will turn your horses around and ride back to town. When the trail is clear, I will bring her in myself." Jebediah's bluster seemed to deflate slightly in the face of Eli's cold calm. He was a man used to bullying, not to facing down quiet death. "Now see here, Kincaid, I'm family. You're just a hired hand. You have no claim here." "My only claim," Eli said, his voice like ice, "is to see that she comes to no more harm. That includes the harm of wagging tongues and foul minds. Now, get out of here before I forget my manners." The three men exchanged uneasy glances. They were armed, but there was a certainty in Eli's stance, a promise of violence in his eyes, that they were not prepared to challenge. He was one man, but he was a different breed from them. They were bullies. He was a killer. Jebediah finally gathered his reins, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. "This ain't over, Kincaid. There are laws. She has made a scandal of herself. The whole town will know what kind of woman she is." They began to turn their horses, defeated for the moment. But Riggs, unwilling to leave without a final shot, urged his horse a step closer. He looked past Eli, his eyes searching the darkness of the cabin, trying to catch a glimpse of Clara. He then spat a thick glob of tobacco juice into the snow near the doorway. He looked directly at Eli, but his words were meant for the woman he knew was listening inside. "You can't protect her from what she is, Kincaid. She came out here to marry a man she'd never met, and before he's even cold in the ground, she's shacked up with another. She's ruined, and a ruined woman ain't worth the trouble." The word hit Clara with the force of a physical impact. Ruined. It was a word her father had used, a brand he had threatened her with her entire life. It meant to be spoiled, discarded, worthless. It was the final judgment, the seal on a woman's damnation. Eli took a step forward, his hand finally closing around the butt of his gun, but the men were already spurring their horses, kicking up snow as they retreated, their triumphant, ugly laughter echoing in the vast, white silence. Eli stood for a long moment, staring after them, before he slowly closed the door and dropped the heavy bar back into place. The cabin was plunged back into its familiar dimness, but the atmosphere was poisoned. The fragile peace was shattered. He turned to look at Clara. She was still in the corner, pressed against the logs as if trying to disappear into them. Her face was as white as the snow outside, her eyes wide with a shame so profound it seemed to steal the very air from her lungs. She could not look at him. She felt dirty, exposed, as if the men's foul words had physically slimed her. She said nothing. She walked stiffly to her cot and sat down, her back to him, and pulled a blanket around her shoulders. The day passed in a silence that was heavier and more painful than any they had yet endured. The outside world had finally found them, and it had brought all its judgment and cruelty with it. That night, she could not sleep. The word echoed in her mind. Ruined, ruined, ruined. It was not just what the man had said, it was that she believed him. Her entire life, she had been taught that her worth was tied to her purity, her reputation. She had fled her father's house to escape being his property, only to find herself viewed as public property, to be judged and dissected by strangers. And the deepest, most terrible part of her shame was for the kiss, for the warmth she had felt with Eli, for wanting him, in the eyes of the world, and in the secret, frightened corners of her own heart. That desire was her true crime. It proved them right. She was no better than they said. A single hot tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek, then another. Soon, a silent, racking sob shook her frame. She curled into a ball, pulling the blanket over her head, and wept. She cried for the life she had lost, for the freedom that was a sham, for the crushing weight of a shame she could not escape. She cried for the small, tender shoot of hope that had begun to grow in her heart, which the world had just stomped into the dirt. She did not know how long she cried before she felt a presence beside the cot. She felt the mattress dip as he sat on the edge. "Clara!" Eli's voice was low, rough with an emotion she could not name. She flinched, pulling the blanket tighter, hiding her face. She did not want him to see her like this. She did not want his pity. "Go away," she choked out between sobs. "Please." He did not go away. He was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke again, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "Clara May." He used her full name. Not just Clara, the woman in his cabin, but Clara May, the person she was before all of this. Hearing it, spoken with such quiet reverence, was like a key turning in a lock deep inside her. Her sobs subsided into ragged, shuddering breaths. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently pull the blanket away from her face. She kept her eyes squeezed shut, but she could feel his gaze on her, warm and steady. "Those men," he said, his voice tight with anger, "are not worth the salt in your tears. They are nothing." "They are right," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I am—" What he said, "I am ruined." "No," he said, his voice fierce. "You are not." He paused, searching for the words. "You look at me." Clara May. Slowly, hesitantly, she opened her eyes. His face was close to hers, his expression one of a deep, aching sincerity. The hardness was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability that mirrored her own. "Do you think I have not felt a cold like this before?" he asked, his voice low and intense. "The cold I was in when I came to this place. It had nothing to do with the snow. It was a cold in here." He touched his chest, over his heart. "A barren, frozen place. From all the things I've done, all the people I've failed. I was a dead man walking in a frozen world. And then I met you." He shook his head, a look of wonder on his face. "I watched you. I watched you sweep the floor. I watched you light a candle against the dark. I watched you mend my coat. I watched you stand up to this whole damned wilderness with nothing but the spine in your back. You were not just surviving. You were fighting for the light." He reached out and gently cupped her tear-stained cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear. "You think you needed me for warmth? Clara May, you were the fire. You walked into this cold, dead place, and you brought the warmth with you. You saved me from a cold far deeper than any blizzard." His words washed over her, a healing balm on a raw wound. He did not see her as ruined. He saw her as a survivor, as his savior. He saw her as strong. The truth of what he was saying settled in her heart, a profound and earth-shattering revelation. He was not her rescuer. They were two survivors, clinging to the same piece of wreckage in a vast, cold sea. The tears that came now were not of shame, but of a wrenching, overwhelming relief. She leaned into his touch, her whole body trembling with the force of her emotions. He gathered her into his arms, holding her against his chest, and for the first time in her life, she felt completely and utterly safe. He held her until her tears subsided, rocking her gently. When she was quiet, he tilted her chin up and kissed her. It was not like the first time. There was no hesitation now, no uncertainty. It was a kiss of deep, knowing tenderness, a silent promise. Slowly, he lowered her back onto the cot and began to unbutton the simple dress she wore. His movements were slow, reverent, his eyes never leaving hers. Every touch was a question, and her stillness was the answer. This was not an act of possession or of lust. It was the final, inevitable crumbling of the walls between them. It was a prayer whispered from skin to skin. In the flickering firelight, he saw the faint, faded marks on her shoulders, the ghosts of old bruises, a map of a past she had never spoken of but which he now understood completely. He traced the lines with a featherlight touch, his expression one of infinite sorrow, not for her, but for the pain she had endured. And she, in turn, discovered him. She ran her hands over the hard, corded muscles of his back, feeling the landscape of his own history. She found the puckered, raised scar of an old bullet wound near his ribs, the thin white line of a knife cut on his arm, a geography of violence and survival. She touched each one, not with pity, but with a sense of wonder, of recognition. These were the marks of the man who had sat with her in the dark, who had held her hand, who had called her by her name. Their coming together was a slow, aching, trembling thing. It was full of a vulnerability so profound it was almost painful. It was not the fire of passion, but the deep, foundational heat of two souls recognizing each other, of two broken pieces fitting together to make a fragile, beautiful whole. It was a silent conversation, where every touch, every glance, every shared breath spoke of acceptance, of forgiveness, of a profound and aching homecoming. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the blankets, the fire burning down to embers. The cabin was quiet. Outside, the world was still. Clara lay with her head on his chest, her fingers idly tracing the line of his oldest scar. He held her close, one hand stroking her hair. No words were needed. They had both been through a different kind of war, had fought their own battles in silence. Tonight, in this small, isolated cabin, they had finally found their truce. They understood each other in a language far older and truer than speech. Spring did not arrive with a gentle announcement. It came with the sound of water, a constant, steady dripping from the eaves of the cabin, a soft gurgling from beneath the snowdrifts, a deep, groaning sigh from the awakening earth. The light at the window grew stronger each day, and soon, patches of dark, wet ground began to appear like islands in a sea of melting white. The air, for so long sharp and sterile, now carried the rich, loamy scent of mud and pine. For Clara and Eli, it was a time of fragile peace. The thaw that had begun in their hearts during the storm's final days continued in the quiet work of spring. They moved with an easy, synchronized rhythm, a silent understanding passing between them. Together, they repaired the section of fence that had collapsed under the snow's weight. Eli taught her how to check the horses for stone bruise, and she, in turn, showed him how to make a passable stew from the last of the salt pork and the first edible green shoots she found near the creek bed. They did not speak of the future. They did not speak of what they had become to one another. They simply existed in the long, hopeful days. Their shared past a silent bond. Their future a question they were not yet brave enough to ask. The cabin, once a prison, had become a sanctuary. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, not out of necessity against the cold, but out of a comfortable habit. He would whittle a piece of scrap wood into a smooth, featureless shape, and she would mend a tear in her dress. The silence between them as warm and soft as a well-worn blanket. This quiet, domestic truce was shattered on a Tuesday. The sun was high, and the air was so clear the distant mountains looked close enough to touch. They were outside, reinforcing the woodpile. When the sound of approaching riders reached them, it was not the clumsy, vulgar approach of Jebediah Broder and his men. This was the steady, measured pace of men with a purpose. 2 riders crested the hill. One was Jebediah, his face set in a look of smug vindication. The other was an older man with a silver star pinned to his vest, the sheriff of Bitter Ridge. Clara's heart seized. She felt Eli's body tense beside her, a low, protective stillness falling over him. They stood together, a silent, united front, as the riders reined in their horses a few yards away. The sheriff, a man named Miller with weary, impartial eyes, dismounted slowly. He nodded at Eli, then let his gaze fall on Clara. There was no judgment in his expression, only a tired resignation. "Ma'am," he began, his voice a gravelly baritone. "Mr. Kincaid, I'm Sheriff Miller." "Sheriff," Eli said, his voice flat and even. "This is private property." "Ordinarily, I'd agree," Miller said, stroking his graying mustache. "But a complaint has been filed. Mr. Broder here." He gestured with his thumb toward Jebediah, who puffed out his chest. "Has made some serious accusations. He claims that you, Kincaid, have taken advantage of this woman's delicate situation, that you are unlawfully occupying his cousin's property and have compromised the lady's reputation and good name." Eli's eyes narrowed to dangerous slits, but he said nothing. "Now, I am a man who prefers to let folks handle their own affairs," the sheriff continued, his gaze shifting back to Clara. "But the law is the law. Mr. Broder is Cyrus Broder's next of kin, until a will is found or a probate court says otherwise. He has a claim. He is demanding that you, Mr. Kincaid, vacate the premises, and that you, ma'am, be placed under the town's protection until your affairs can be sorted out." "I am not in need of protection," Clara said, her voice shaking but clear. "I am fine here." The sheriff gave her a look that was almost pitying. "Ma'am, with all due respect, it is not seemly. It is not right. The town, well, folks are talking. A formal hearing has been set for Friday morning. A circuit judge is due in town. He will hear Mr. Broder's claim and your testimony. Until then, I have to ask you to come back to Bitter Ridge with me. There is a room for you at the boarding house. It is for your own good." There was no choice. To refuse would be to defy the law, to make them look guiltier than they already did in the town's eyes. A cold knot of dread formed in Clara's stomach. Their sanctuary was about to be violated. The quiet world they had built together was about to be put on trial. Eli went to saddle the horses, his movements stiff with a barely contained fury. As Clara gathered her few things, Jebediah watched her, his eyes filled with a greedy, possessive light. He was not just looking at a woman, he was looking at a homestead, at acres of land, at a prize he believed was rightfully his. The ride to Bitter Ridge was a journey into a different kind of winter. The town, which had seemed a desolate but neutral place on her arrival, now felt like a nest of vipers. As they rode down the muddy main street, windows parted, faces peered out, and a low, insidious murmur seemed to follow them like a cloud of flies. Clara kept her eyes fixed on the back of Eli's head, her spine ramrod straight, refusing to look at the faces, refusing to acknowledge the whispers. Sheriff Miller installed her in a small, clean room at the top of the boarding house, run by a stern, hawk-faced woman named Mrs. Gable, who looked at Clara as if she were a piece of filth that had been tracked in on a boot. "Supper is at 6, she said, her voice thin and sharp. "There will be no visitors. The sheriff's orders." Eli was allowed to stable the horses, and then he was told to find a room at the saloon, a place for rootless men, far from the respectable sphere of the boarding house. As he left her, he met her eyes, and in their depths she saw a storm of frustration and a profound, aching sorrow. He felt he had failed her, had led her from one prison straight into another. The days leading up to the hearing were a special kind of hell. The town of Bitter Ridge put Clara on trial long before the judge arrived. When she ventured out for a walk, conversations would cease as she passed, only to resume in venomous whispers behind her. The men would stare at her with a look that was a foul mixture of contempt and crude speculation. But it was the women who were the cruelest. They saw her not as a woman in trouble, but as a contagion, a threat to the rigid, fragile order of their lives. They looked at her with a cold, unforgiving fury, their eyes accusing her of a sin they could not name but feared above all else, the sin of being outside their rules. On Sunday, determined not to be cowed into hiding, she went to the small wooden church. As she stepped inside, a wave of silence rolled through the pews. The preacher faltered in his sermon. Every woman in the congregation turned, their faces a gallery of righteous condemnation. They clutched their Bibles and their children tighter, their glares sharp and pointed, turning a house of God into a pillory. Clara sat alone in the back pew, her cheeks burning with a shame that was not her own, and endured. The final blow came in the form of her own words. Jebediah, it turned out, had collected her letters to Cyrus from the postmaster. They were letters she had penned in desperation, filled with the careful, constructed lies of a woman trying to secure her escape. She had written of her respect for Mr. Broder's hard-working nature, her eagerness to be a good and dutiful wife, her desire for a quiet life on the frontier. Jebediah did not keep them to himself. He read them aloud in the saloon, showed them to the ladies of the church auxiliary. Her carefully chosen words were twisted into evidence of her deceit. Here was proof that she was a duplicitous woman who had come with false intentions, only to discard her intended groom for a younger, more exciting man at the first opportunity. Her own handwriting became the weapon that damned her. The night before the hearing, Eli came to the boarding house. Mrs. Gable tried to stop him at the stairs, but he walked past her as if she were a ghost, his face set like granite. He found Clara sitting by the window in her small room, staring out at the darkening town. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, his heart aching at the sight of her, so small and alone. "I should leave," he said, his voice low and raw. "I can be gone before morning. If I am not here, they will have less to point a finger at. They will see you as a widow to be pitied, not a sinner to be condemned." He took a step into the room, his hands clenched at his sides. "They'll never stop judging you, Clara. Not if I am standing next to you. My past, it follows me. It's a shadow, and it will fall on you too." Clara turned from the window. Her eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, but a fire burned in their depths. She had been bent by the town's cruelty, but she was not broken. She rose from her chair and walked toward him. "You think they judge me because of you?" she asked, her voice quiet but ringing with a strength that stunned him. "You think my reputation was spotless before I met you?" She stopped in front of him, her gaze unwavering. "I have been judged my entire life. Eli, judged by my father for not being a son, judged for being too quiet, for being too willful, judged for the bruises I was supposed to hide. I was judged the moment I stepped on that train, a woman traveling alone to a man she did not know. They judged me long before they knew you." She reached out and laid a hand on his chest, over his heart. "You are not my ruin. You are the only thing that is not. Leaving would be the worst thing you could do, because it would mean they have won. It would mean that their whispers are stronger than what we found in that cabin, and I will not let that be true." The hearing was held in the town hall, a large, drafty room that smelled of stale cigar smoke and sawdust. It was packed. The entire population of Bitter Ridge, it seemed, had turned out for the spectacle. They sat on hard wooden benches, their faces a sea of grim curiosity. Clara sat at a small table at the front, with Sheriff Miller beside her. Jebediah Browder was at another table, looking smug and confident, his two hired hands sitting behind him like vultures. Eli stood at the back of the room, his arms crossed over his chest, his face unreadable. He had refused to sit, preferring to watch from the periphery, a silent, imposing guardian. The judge was a man named Harrison, with a tired face and a gavel he used sparingly. He listened patiently as Jebediah, represented by a smarmy lawyer from a bigger town, laid out his case. They painted a picture of a virtuous, hard-working man, Cyrus Broder, duped by a conniving woman from the East. They spoke of property and inheritance, of propriety and moral decency. They presented her letters as evidence of her fraudulent character. Then it was Clara's turn. "Miss Thompson," Judge Harrison said, his voice not unkind, "the floor is yours. Tell us your side of this matter." Clara rose to her feet. Her hands were trembling. Her knees felt weak. She looked out at the faces staring at her, the sneering men, the hard-eyed women. For a moment, her courage failed her. She felt small and utterly alone. Her voice was just a faint whisper. "My name is Clara May Thompson." Her voice cracked on the last word. A wave of shame washed over her. She faltered, her gaze dropping to the floor. From the back of the room, she felt a surge of strength, a silent message. She looked up and met Eli's eyes. He gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. He did not smile. He did not need to. His eyes said everything. I am here. You are not alone." She took a deep breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was stronger. "I came to Bitter Ridge to marry Mr. Cyrus Broder. That much is true, but I did not come here out of love, or even out of respect. I came here out of fear." A murmur went through the crowd. "I came here to escape my father's house," she continued, her voice gaining power with every word. "A house that may have looked respectable to the outside world, but which was, for me, a prison. I grew up in a place where a man's word was law, and his hand was an instrument of that law. I was his property, to be disciplined as he saw fit, and to be married off as he saw fit, to increase his own wealth and standing." She looked directly at the women in the front row, the ones who had glared at her in church. "I made a bargain. I answered an advertisement to become a wife to a stranger because the life he offered, no matter how hard, seemed better than the one I had. Cyrus Broder was not a husband to me. He was an escape route. That is the truth of it." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Then he died, and I was left in a cabin, in the middle of the worst storm in memory, with a man I did not know. The world disappeared. There was no town. There was no law. There was only the cold." Her gaze drifted to the back of the room, to Eli. "For weeks, we survived. We shared what little food we had. We kept the fire lit. And in that place, in all that ice and silence, I found something. I found a man who did not see me as property. A man who taught me how to hold a gun to protect myself. Who listened to my story without judgment. A man who was haunted by his own past, but who still had the kindness in him to chafe my frozen hands back to life." Her voice cracked again, but this time with the force of her emotion, not weakness. "You talk of my reputation. You whisper that I am ruined. You hold up my letters as proof of my sin. But the only sin I am guilty of is wanting to be free. The only shame I feel is forever believing I did not deserve to be." She turned her gaze back to the judge, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Jebediah Broder talks about the law. He talks about what is his by blood. He believes this cabin, this land, belongs to him, and perhaps by your laws. It does, but no law and no piece of paper ever made me Cyrus Broder's wife. A piece of paper cannot own a person's heart." She stood taller, her voice ringing with a conviction that silenced the entire room. "My choice, however, I have made my choice, and I choose to stand with the man who showed me that warmth is something you find not in a fire, but in another person's soul." A profound, stunned silence descended upon the town hall. Clara's words, a testament of raw, unvarnished truth, hung in the air, echoing in the space left by the whispers and accusations. The townspeople, who had come for a spectacle of shame, had been given something else entirely, a glimpse into a woman's soul. They stared at her, their expressions a mixture of shock, confusion, and, for a few, a dawning, reluctant respect. Jebediah Broder's face was a mask of thunderous rage, his case built on propriety and insinuation having just been demolished by a truth far more powerful. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He looked at Clara for a long moment, then turned his gaze to Sheriff Miller. "Sheriff," the judge said, his voice carrying the weight of the law, "you mentioned Mr. Cyrus Broder's body was recovered from the trail once the thaw began." "That is correct, Your Honor," Miller answered, rising to his feet. "And his personal effects?" The sheriff reached into the inner pocket of his coat. "We found his pocket watch, a few dollars, and this." He produced a folded, oilskin-wrapped packet and handed it to the judge. "It was in his breast pocket, sealed against the weather." Judge Harrison carefully unwrapped the packet. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the contents. He read it once, then a second time, his eyebrows rising slightly. He looked over his spectacles at Jebediah, then at Clara. "It would seem," the judge announced, his voice ringing with finality, That this entire proceeding has been based on a false premise. This document, dated the day before Mr. Broder set out to meet his bride-to-be, is his last will and testament. It is simple, direct, and witnessed by the postmaster and the blacksmith in Bitter Ridge. He held up the paper. It reads, "In the event of my death, I, Cyrus Broder, being of sound mind, do leave my entire property, including the 160 acres of my homestead, the cabin, and all livestock, to my intended wife, Miss Clara May Thompson. She came a long way for a new life. It is only right she should have it. It is signed, Cyrus Broder." A collective gasp went through the room. Jebediah Broder shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. "That is impossible. He would never. The land is mine. I am his blood." "You are his cousin, Mr. Broder," the judge said calmly, his gaze like iron. "But his word is the law, and his last word on the matter is this will. The property, the cabin, everything belongs to Miss Thompson, legally and unequivocally. This hearing is concluded." He banged his gavel once, the sharp crack sealing Jebediah's fate. The room erupted into a buzz of conversation. Defeated and humiliated, Jebediah stormed out of the town hall, his hired hands trailing behind him like curs. The townspeople began to file out, their expressions unreadable, their whispers now of a different, more uncertain nature. They had condemned a woman who was not, in fact, an interloper, but the rightful owner of the land they had assumed was stolen. Clara stood frozen, her hand resting on the table for support. His final act. The harsh, silent man she had never met had, in the end, given her the very thing she had been searching for, a place to stand that was her own. It was not a gift of love, but of a rough, frontier fairness. It was a foundation. Eli was by her side in an instant, his hand lightly on her elbow, guiding her through the last of the dispersing crowd. He did not speak, but she could feel the fierce pride radiating from him. They walked out into the bright, muddy street, the world feeling both strange and new. They returned to the homestead that afternoon. The moment they crested the final hill and saw the small, sturdy cabin nestled in the valley, a profound sense of peace settled over Clara. It was no longer a dead man's house or a temporary shelter. It was home, her home. But as the days turned into a week, a subtle distance grew between them. Eli was quiet, more so than usual. He worked from sunup to sundown, his energy focused and relentless. He repaired the roof, reinforced the corral, and cleared stones from the small plot of land she had marked for a garden. He worked as a hired hand would, with a grim determination that kept him from meeting her eyes for too long. Clara understood. In town, she had claimed him, but here, in the reality of their new life, he was claiming nothing. He was a man with a past full of gunpowder and regret, a wanderer with nothing to his name but the horse he rode and the gun on his hip. She was now a woman of property, a landowner. In his mind, the gulf between them had widened into a chasm. He believed he had no place here, that his continued presence would only tarnish her newfound standing, would only confirm the town's ugliest suspicions. One morning, she woke just before dawn to the sound of him moving about the cabin. It was an unusual sound. He was always careful not to wake her. She lay still, her eyes closed, and listened. She heard the soft clink of his buckle, the rustle of him packing his few belongings into his saddlebags, the quiet creak of the floorboards as he moved toward the door. He was leaving. The realization was a cold, sharp pain in her chest. He was going to slip away in the pre-dawn quiet, to save her from himself. He paused by her cot, and she felt his presence, a shadow standing over her. She knew he was looking at her, saying his silent goodbye. A long moment passed, and then he was gone, the cabin door closing with a soft, final click. Clara threw back the blanket, her heart hammering. She would not allow it. She would not let him make this choice for her. She pulled on her dress and boots, not bothering with stockings, and ran out into the crisp, cold morning air. He was at the gate of the corral, tightening the cinch on his saddle. His horse stood patiently, its breath pluming in the dawn light. He had not seen her approach. He swung the saddlebags over the horse's back, his movements economical and final. He was erasing himself from her life. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice clear and steady in the quiet morning. He froze, his back to her. He did not turn around for a long moment. When he finally did, his face was a mask of stoic resolve, but she could see the profound sorrow in his eyes. "My work here is done," he said, his voice rough. "You are safe. The land is yours. You have a start now." "And you?" she pressed. "Where will you go?" He shrugged, a gesture of weary resignation. "Does not matter. South. Maybe. There is always work for a man who can ride and shoot." He looked away, toward the distant mountains. "You have a chance here, Clara, a chance to build a decent life, to be respected. My staying here, it will only hold you back. The town will never let you forget." "I do not care about the town," she said fiercely, taking a step closer. "You should," he countered, his voice sharp with a pain he could not hide. "You deserve better than to be tied to a man like me. I have nothing to offer you, nothing but a name that is known in all the wrong places and a past that is better left buried." He turned back to his horse, preparing to mount, to ride away and disappear forever. "Eli?" He stopped, his hand on the saddle horn. She walked right up to him until she was standing between him and his horse, blocking his escape. She looked up into his tormented face, her own expression a mixture of love and unyielding determination. "I stood in that town hall and I told the truth. I told them all who I was and why I was here. I did not do that so you could ride away and leave me to face it alone." She reached out and placed her hand on his chest, her touch firm, possessive. "I stood outside this cabin, half frozen, and I dug a hole in the snow with my bare hands. And do you know what I put in it?" He just stared at her, his eyes full of a silent, desperate question. "My wedding dress," she said, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "The symbol of the life I was supposed to have, the woman I was supposed to be. I buried her. I let her go." She looked at him, her gaze unwavering, her meaning absolute. "I did not bury that dress for nothing." The wall around his heart, the one he had spent a lifetime building, did not just crack, it shattered. In her eyes, he did not see a woman he was ruining. He saw a woman who was claiming him, who was choosing him, with all his scars and all his ghosts. He saw a strength that matched his own, a courage that shamed his instinct to run. He saw a home. A single, ragged breath escaped him. He reached up and covered her hand with his own, his thumb stroking the back of her knuckles. He did not speak. He did not need to. The surrender was in his eyes, in the softening of his jaw, in the way he leaned into her touch. He stayed. But he did not stay as a hired hand or a man just passing through. He stayed as a partner. Together, they began to rebuild. They did not just repair the homestead, they remade it. They worked side by side, plank by plank, nail by nail. Eli, with his quiet strength, tore down the old, rotting lean-to, and with Clara helping him measure and saw, they built a new, sturdy stable. Clara, with her patient determination, tilled the rocky soil in her garden plot until her hands were raw, planting seeds that held the promise of a future. They were building more than a homestead. They were building a life, a shared existence forged in the quiet rhythm of their labor. Their conversations were often wordless. A shared glance over a freshly sawn board, a bottle of water passed from one to the other under the hot sun. They were learning the language of partnership, of building something together that was stronger than either of them could have built alone. The townspeople kept their distance. When Clara rode into Bitter Ridge for supplies, the whispers still followed her, though they were more muted now. tinged with a grudging curiosity. She was no longer just the scandalous widow. She was the woman who had faced them all down, the woman who owned the Broder place and worked it like a man. She ignored their stares, held her head high, and conducted her business with a quiet dignity that offered them nothing to gossip about. Then, one evening, a small miracle occurred. As Clara stepped onto the porch after a long day in the garden, she found a small package wrapped in cloth sitting on the top step. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a freshly baked apple pie. Still warm, there was no note, but she knew. Her nearest neighbor, miles down the valley, was an old widow named Mrs. Elmira Croft, a woman who had sat in the back of the town hall during the hearing and had watched Clara with eyes that held not judgment, but a deep, knowing sorrow. Clara carried the pie inside. Eli looked up from the table where he was cleaning his rifle. She placed the pie between them. It was more than just a dessert. It was a message, an offering, a small, sweet truce in their silent war with the world. They would not be welcomed with open arms, but perhaps they would not be entirely cast out either. The seasons turned. The green of spring deepened into the lush, sun-drenched green of summer. Clara and Eli's life settled into the rhythms of the land. They rode out together into the high country, Eli with his rifle, Clara with a smaller one he had bought for her. He taught her how to track, how to read the signs of the earth. They were a team, moving through the wild, beautiful, unforgiving landscape as one. They hunted deer for their winter meat and cleared dead brush from the edges of their property to guard against the threat of fire. Side by side, they faced the challenges of the land, their bond growing stronger with each shared task, each silent sunset. One night in late autumn, the first snow of the coming winter began to fall. It was not a blizzard, not a raging storm, but a gentle, quiet flurry of soft, white flakes dancing in the darkness outside the cabin window. They sat before the hearth, the fire casting a warm, flickering glow on their faces. Eli was sharpening a knife, the scrape of steel on stone a soft, rhythmic sound. Clara was mending a tear in his shirt, her stitches small and neat. She finished her work, bit off the thread, and set the shirt aside. She watched the snow falling outside, then looked at the fire, then at the man beside her. A deep, quiet contentment filled her, a feeling so profound it felt like a prayer. She curled up beside him, resting her head on his shoulder, her arm circling his waist. He stopped his work, letting the knife and stone rest in his lap, and put his arm around her, holding her close. They sat like that for a long time, watching the fire and the snow, two quiet figures in a small pocket of warmth carved out of the vast, cold wilderness. "I do not need the fire anymore," she whispered, her voice soft against his shirt. He looked down at her, a question in his eyes. She lifted her head and met his gaze, her eyes shining in the firelight with a love that was as steady and as true as the mountains. "Just you." Outside, the land was still harsh, the wind still bit with the promise of a long winter to come, and the world beyond their small valley was still full of judgment and hardship. But inside the cabin, nestled together in the quiet dark, the warmth was real, and it was shared. Thank you for listening to our story. Comment where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.